You're listening to The Conversation. 6 years ago, as the world went into COVID lockdown, the air got cleaner. Factories slowed down, roads emptied, and aeroplanes were grounded. And as we were burning fewer fossil fuels, carbon dioxide emissions dropped. For all the horrors of COVID, it felt like maybe this could offer an unexpected reprieve for the planet, a moment to breathe. But something else was also happening in the atmosphere. Levels of methane, an extremely potent greenhouse gas that warms the planet even faster than CO2, rose faster in 2020 than at any point in recorded history. And methane levels kept rising for the next 2 years. Ever since, scientists have been trying to figure out what caused this sudden, mysterious increase in methane. Now, they think they have the answer, and it was partly due to us all staying at home in lockdown. I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, a news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. In this episode, why global methane levels spiked during the pandemic, and what the answer reveals about how we can stop it happening again. Philippe Sias, you're a researcher at the Laboratory of Climate and Environmental Science at Paris-Saclay University in France, where you're a specialist in the global carbon cycle of our planet. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly.
Thank you for the invitation.
So, Philippe, around this time 5 years ago, we interviewed one of your collaborators, Corinne Le Carré, for an episode of this podcast, and it was about how there'd been a large drop in carbon dioxide emissions during that first year of the pandemic when everybody was in lockdown. What do you remember about that time and the way you and your fellow scientists were thinking about the way COVID was affecting the planet?
Yeah, we remember that period, of course, because first of all, we were all confined, but also thinking about the global planetary implications of this confinement, in particular the fact that a lot of substances which are produced by human activities have been reduced at that time. So one obvious thing that was done by Corinne was to analyze by how much carbon dioxide emissions have been reduced. And the answer is yes, they were reduced during the peak of the confinement, but actually not so much, on average by only 6%. And then there was a quick rebound of emissions with the resumption of human activity.
So was it almost a bit like a good news moment then, amid the horror of the lockdowns and of COVID and the pandemic, that we were actually reducing some of our carbon dioxide emissions?
Well, it made us thought about what to look for in order to understand the impact of this massive reduction of human activity. Is the impact limited to carbon dioxide emissions? Does it also affect pollution? And what we've been looking at now is how those reduced emissions of pollutants have been affecting atmospheric chemistry, and in particular, the growth of methane in the atmosphere.
And when did you first become aware that levels of methane had spiked during the pandemic?
We watch the atmospheric methane thanks to very accurate data which are collected by our colleagues from the US and other atmospheric observation network. So between the beginning and the end of the year, they estimate the growth rate of methane. And we noticed that in 2020 and then in 2021 and a bit in 22, the growth rate of methane has been extremely high. In fact, it has been higher than ever recorded before, since the measurement started in the middle of the 80s.
Was it a surprise to you when you saw that it was going up?
We did not expect such a surge or spike of methane when it started to rise in 2020. So we started to worry, but also we wanted to understand what were the underlying mechanisms for this very fast rise of methane in the atmosphere at that time.
And why were you so worried? Why is methane so bad for our planet?
Methane is bad because it's more effective than carbon dioxide at warming the climate. It's a greenhouse gas, but it traps the radiation emitting by the Earth to give it back to the Earth. So every ton of methane we put into the atmosphere is warming the air faster than a ton of CO2. However, methane is also an opportunity because unlike carbon dioxide, which stays in the atmosphere forever once it has been loaded by human activity, methane only stays in the atmosphere for about a decade, which means that if we could cut emissions, we should be able to reduce the methane concentration and to cool the climate. So there is a very big opportunity for reducing methane emissions in order to cool the climate or to reduce the current rate of warming.
So you and your colleagues saw this spike. I think it was around double the methane in that first year of the pandemic than had been over the previous 10 years. What were some of your initial hypotheses for what might have been going on?
Well, you always two suspects. Either it's on the side of emissions. For methane, you have both emissions which are created directly by human activities like agriculture or the extraction of fossil fuel, but you have also some natural emissions that are sensitive to the climate. The other side of the coin is changes in the atmospheric removal of methane. The atmosphere contains this fantastic cleaning agent, hydroxy called OH, and this cleaning agent is Pac-Man of the atmosphere. So any subtle change of OH is capable to either reduce or to accelerate the growth of methane in the atmosphere. OH radicals, they are very difficult to measure. Nobody can measure them. They live less than 1 second. They are produced by carbon monoxide, which is pollution gas produced by combustion, and by nitrous oxide, the famous NOx, which makes the atmosphere brown over polluted cities in the day. And nitrous oxide, when they are present from pollution, they facilitate the production of OH.
How does it remove the methane?
In the chain of complex chemical reactions in the atmosphere that leads to the formation of NOx, OH is kind of generated. So when you have more NOx, when it's polluted, you have an increase of OH. And conversely, when you have a reduced emission of NOx, you have a weakening of the OH. You have less concentration of this cleaning agent. And as a result, methane increasing more fastly in the atmosphere. Most of this cleaning agent OH, you will find it high up in the atmosphere, about 5 to 6 kilometers, and in the tropics where you have a lot of radiation, because radiation is also involved in the production of OH. So it's really sunny places in the middle of the atmosphere where you have a lot of penetration of light that OH develops. And this big bubble of OH that you see everywhere in the tropics is responsible for, killing the methane that arrives to the tropics after it is emitted by all sorts of activities at the surface.
Have we known this for a long time, that OH breaks down methane?
Oh, yeah. We know it. And it's a chance for us, because if we didn't have this cleaning agent, every year we would see a tremendous increase of methane in the atmosphere, and the climate would warm, tremendously. So in fact, this chemical reaction that removes methane from the atmosphere, it's very strong because it's removing about 95% of the total amount of emissions which is loaded in the atmosphere. But it's not a perfect cleaning. If OH would remove 100% of what we put in, we would see no increase of methane in the air. And we see some increase because our emissions are kind of overwhelming or surpassing the cleaning power of the atmosphere.
Philippe, you and your colleagues have just published a new research paper in the journal Science, which looks at these OH levels, and it suggests that the majority of this spike in methane, around 80% of it in fact, was caused by a decrease in OH linked to declines in emissions from human activities during the COVID lockdown. Tell me what you found.
We found indeed that the reason of the spike was mainly because of weaker hydroxy radicals, smaller concentration, but also because of a surplus or an increase of natural methane emission by wetlands. So it's kind of two reasons that came together at the same time to explain this spike of methane.
What you're saying really is that one of the reasons why there was a decrease in OH was because people were driving less, people were emitting less pollution. So it's quite a difficult thing to square when you're thinking about the climate. Our air was cleaner, and yet it wasn't breaking down the methane enough, so the atmosphere perhaps could have warmed more.
Yeah, well, of course, you would like to say, pollution is a good thing because it removes methane. Well, it's a bit more subtle than that. It depends where this nitrous oxide is emitted. It also does not depend only on the pollution from human activities. It also depends a lot on the amount of pollutants which are produced by wildfires, because wildfires burn a lot of fuel. So it's not only purely controlled by human activities, but it's a complex interplay of chemical reactions That have to see, of course, with the amount of nitrous oxide that we load in the atmosphere. So indeed, yes, less emissions means less OH and more methane, but it's also modulated by a number of carbon substances which are produced by the vegetation, carbon monoxide from fires, radiation, and even water vapor.
So when you did this study, you were really looking for where the methane was coming from, which is difficult. But you found that it wasn't just the decrease in OH that was the culprit. You also found an increase in natural emissions of methane. Where was that coming from, and how did you find that out?
Well, it's a problem that has two solutions, right? Either it can be OH or it can be emissions. And the real difficulty is to separate the two. So how do we do that? Well, we use atmospheric concentration measurements at a lot of places, which are measured by a Japanese satellite called GOSAT. And the first thing is to try to fix the OH. And as I was explaining, we cannot measure it. So we don't have any records of OH. But we managed to make a prediction of how much OH has changed using a chemistry model that simulates the anomaly of OH and using another model which is reading satellite observations of nitrous oxide, NOx emissions, and also satellite observation of carbon monoxide. So you can basically tell how much OH is everywhere using those satellite observations. So that allowed us to estimate the amount of changes from OH. And that's a fundamental step because otherwise you are double blind, right? You don't know what is happening. Once we simulate the effect of OH, we can still see that, well, we don't completely match with our models the growth rate. There is still something missing. And this something missing must come from surface emissions. But the enigma is still not solved because, unfortunately, there are many, many different types of emissions. Human extraction of fossil fuel, like coal mining, oil and gas extraction, is leaky. It's producing leaks of methane. So it can come from more emissions related to the extraction of fossil fuel. It can also be agriculture. Rice is emitting methane. Animals, livestock, cattle are emitting methane. And it can also come from what we call natural sources, like wildfires, and those famous wetlands, because many areas of the planet are flat and they are flooded. And when it's flat and flooded and there is carbon, those regions called wetlands or peatlands, they do emit a lot of methane. And those natural emissions, they're also sensitive to climate conditions. If it's a bit warmer, if it's a bit wetter, you can have a surge of local methane emissions by those wetland areas. So we've still been trying to, find out which one of those possible emissions, human-controlled or natural, was explaining this spike. And we found that it's mainly coming from tropical wetlands in the northern tropics, mainly in northern Africa and Asia. So we know that those two regions have been running the show in increasing their emissions and partly explaining the spike of methane in the atmosphere.
And was something happening in the climate in 2020-21 that was causing that particular area of the world to emit more methane through its wetlands?
Yeah, a lot of things have been happening in the climate lately. But from June 2020 up to June 23, all the tropics were under a regime that we call La Nina. La Nina is the opposite of El Nino. And normally during La Nina periods, most part of the tropics tend to get wetter. It's not as simple as you have La Nina is turned on, everybody gets wetter. Of course, it's never simple like this. The Amazon continued to be a bit drier, but yes, Africa, the regions where we suspect methane emissions have increased from wetlands, and Asia, as well as Australia, were wetter. Australia was extremely green, for instance, and all the deserts in the center of Australia have been greening up during this wet period.
Coming up, what this new understanding of why methane spiked means for our ability to reduce it in the future. That's after this short break.
Hiya, I'm Katie Edwards and I'm a health editor at The Conversation.
I'm Dan Baumgart. I'm a lecturer in health and life sciences at the University of Bristol, where I also work as a GP.
And we work together a lot and we try to explain weird and wonderful things about the body. And now we're teaming up to host Strange Health, which is a new video podcast from The Conversation.
So each episode, we're going to be taking a health trend going viral on social media.
You know the kind of thing. Drink chlorophyll to make sure you don't stink.
Do you really need to detox in January?
Have a supplement to make your bum look better. All that kind of thing. Each week, it's going to be me and Dan, plus an expert, who are going to thrash out between the truths and the myths.
You know, me being an anatomist, I was like, oh, can I have a look? And it was huge.
The liver is amazing. It's probably the only organ that can regenerate itself completely.
And we're calling it Strange Health because we're not scared of disgusting things. Episode 1 arrives on the 20th of January. So follow us on YouTube or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Philippe, you established that there was a mixture of reasons for this spike in methane. What happened after the pandemic and when pollution levels went back to where they had been? What happened to methane emissions after that?
The disruption of the entire atmospheric chemistry is a bit more subtle, that pandemics on, more methane, pandemics off, methane returns to normal. So in fact, we have been observing a perturbation of the atmospheric chemistry that lasted longer than just the pandemic duration. It lasted in 21 and in 22. And at the same time, we had these very wet conditions in the tropics that accelerated methane emissions by wetlands. We also think that some of the agricultural emissions have increased at the time, but in a more slow way, because there is no reason to think that suddenly, you double the number of ruminants on Earth and they will double the emissions. But we have also found in our paper that there is also kind of upward trend.
So cows, buffalo.
Cows, buffaloes, and rice, because don't forget that rice is a man-made wetland, and particular rice paddies. So when you have a very strong monsoon, rice stays inundated for longer amount of time, and it's possible also that rice cultivated areas have explained this increase of methane because those were very wet periods in Southeast Asia and in India, where you have a lot of rice cultivation.
Now that we're better placed to understand where methane is coming from, what does that mean for our ability to reduce the level of methane in the atmosphere in the future?
Well, the future is ahead of us, and even more for methane than CO2, because if we are able to cut down methane emissions, the one that we can control, like fossil fuel leaks or some of the agricultural emissions, we should enjoy really a decrease of methane and the net climate cooling. So today, 2/3 of the emissions, they are under human control. They are either coming from agriculture, fossil industry, and landfills, waste, and also wastewater treatment processes. So we have the control on 2/3, and we have also the technologies, if we wanted to reduce and to cut down a lot of leaks in the fossil extraction industry. Cutting down emissions in agriculture is a little bit more complicated because, in the end, farmers have to do the right thing. And there are indeed a number of ways to manage rice cultivation that does not compromise the production of rice, like intermittent flooding, that could help us to reduce the emissions from rice paddies. Regarding cows, well, a lot of companies and farmers are trying to give to their animals some additives which are anti-methanogenic. And when they eat this kind of food, basically methane is produced less by the animals. Right now, it's not at scale, but of course, it's an important area of research. If we would be able to continue to raise animals and still do this by producing less methane. But there is 1/3 of the emissions on which we have little control. We are talking about the wetlands. All these wetlands are very far away generally from human activity. What we found in this study is that they are sensitive to climate anomalies. Like it was wetter in the tropics, and suddenly you see those emissions increasing. We also see, by the way, that as it was warmer in the Arctic, we also see an increase of emission in the Arctic. So those emissions, we don't have any control on them.
If, as your study suggests, the introduction of people driving helped create a spike in methane, is there any modelling that you and your colleagues do on what the introduction of more electric vehicles might do in the future on those OH levels in the atmosphere? Could that actually create a bigger spike in methane in the future?
So this is definitely something we have to study. NOx, this is not only emitted by road traffic, by all the combustions. So power plants also emit a bit less maybe per unit of fuel burnt than road transportation, but several combustion processes emit methane. What is important to understand is not by continuing to drive more that we will reduce methane. It's by reducing emissions, right? And that's the ultimate way we have to prevent methane to increase and to amplify the warming of climate, no?
So is it a wake-up call that we need to do more to cut human-made methane if the natural methane is climbing so rapidly on its own?
Yes, exactly. It's a wake-up call because if we are seeing from like the last few years that natural emissions are not stable, they are highly sensitive to climate and to climate change. So indeed, we need to get a better understanding of what are the climate triggers and the climate controls of natural emissions, and also to try to cut down the emissions that we can control from agriculture and fossil industry in order not to let the natural emissions become wild.
Well, thank you, Philippe. It's been fascinating talking with you and understanding some more of those dynamics. We appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you very much.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. This episode was written and produced by Mend Mariwani, Katie Flood, and me, Gemma Ware. Sound mixing is by Elena Brezzi, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com. And please do also rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. Thanks for listening.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
An autocrat loves a crisis. A crisis is the way that they mobilize their base.
While America is under invasion from within, we're under invasion from within.
He's testing the boundaries of what he can get away with.
We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military.
We've asked 6 of the world's preeminent scholars how we can measure the make of an autocrat. It's a recipe of sorts, tried and tested by the most infamous leaders in history.
Hugo Chavez in Venezuela.
Vladimir Putin in Russia.
Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler.
Viktor Orban in Hungary.
He's basically bulletproof in terms of criminal prosecution.
Join us from December 29 as we explore Trump, the making of an autocrat, from The Conversation.